I used to think betrayal sounded like shouting. Instead, it sounded like a front door closing softly at 6:14 in the morning, never to open for me again. My husband did not threaten, beg, or cry. He simply filed, took the house, and erased himself, letting me discover the man I chose over him was standing on his money the whole time. When I finally understood real revenge, it was too late. My name is Stella Powell, and I am currently sitting completely alone in a cramped, suffocating rental apartment situated directly above a noisy dry cleaner in the dense, sprawling heart of Charlotte, North Carolina. The heavy heat of the late southern afternoon is pressing against the single warped window pane in the living room, but it is absolutely nothing compared to the stifling, claustrophobic reality inside these four thin walls. The harsh, synthetic smell of industrial chemical solvent seeps up through the cheap floorboards continuously, a bitter, biting scent that coats the back of my throat and makes my persistent morning sickness infinitely worse. I am exactly 6 months pregnant. I am surrounded by over a dozen cardboard boxes that are only half unpacked, their brown flaps standing open like exhausted, broken wings. I sit on a stained, secondhand sofa and stare at them for hours on end, but I simply lack the physical stamina and the moral energy to empty them. I am learning, in this depressing, shadowy little room, that the absolute loudest, most deafening revenge a person can ever experience does not come wrapped in screams, shattered glass, or physical violence. It comes wrapped in perfect, unyielding, terrifying silence. When ordinary people watch dramatic television shows or read sensationalized magazine articles, they think they understand exactly how a betrayed spouse reacts to the ultimate, unforgivable infidelity. They naturally expect a fiery, uncontrollable explosion of raw grief and blinding rage. They expect expensive clothing to be thrown dramatically from second-story windows onto the front lawn. They expect tearful, screaming confrontations in the driveway in front of the horrified neighbors. And they expect vicious public smear campaigns designed to ruin the cheater's reputation forever. My husband did absolutely none of those things. He did not destroy me in public. He did not call my closest friends to weep or to viciously curse my name. He did not attempt to humiliate me or get me fired from my comfortable job. He simply removed himself from my orbit so completely, so swiftly, and so incredibly thoroughly that every single room in my life immediately started echoing with his profound, heavy absence. He did not break a single porcelain plate in our beautiful, custom-built kitchen. He just permanently stopped setting a place for me at the dining table. Right now, on the cheap, badly scratched veneer dining table sitting just a few feet in front of me, there is a thick, cream-colored legal envelope. It sits in a grim, bitter little still life directly next to a large, clear plastic bottle of pink prenatal vitamins and a messy, terrifying stack of final notice, unpaid utility bills. That small, cluttered table is the perfect, tragic monument to my current, ruined existence. It perfectly symbolizes exactly how the mundane, tedious machinery of everyday domestic life and the absolute, life-altering catastrophe of my own selfish making collided all at once, occupying the exact same physical space at the exact same time. Tomorrow morning, I have to unscrew the white plastic cap and swallow a large pill to ensure the delicate bones and vital organs of the child growing inside me form correctly. And then I have to sit back down and stare at a piece of heavy, watermarked legal paper that coldly and formally explains how I am being meticulously excised from the only secure, beautiful life I have ever known. I need to be explicitly, brutally clear about something right away, before you spend even one single second feeling sorry for the pregnant, abandoned woman sitting all alone in a cheap rented room. I am absolutely not an innocent narrator in this story. I am not a helpless victim of tragic, unforeseen circumstance, and I was not tricked, manipulated, or coerced into the miserable, humiliating position I'm currently in. I crossed the line. I let my anger soak into the very base of the beautiful home we had built, and I made a deliberate, conscious, utterly selfish choice that blew my marriage apart. I own that terrible truth completely. And honestly, that deep, inescapable accountability is exactly what gives this entire story its unrelenting, agonizing sting. I cannot blame another woman. I cannot blame a misunderstanding. It is completely, undeniably my responsibility. I unraveled my own life through my own choices, and I have to carry the full weight of that decision with me every single day. When you are standing on the very edge of an illicit affair, the dark temptation is always dressed up as overwhelming passion and romantic chaos. It feels like breathless, secret hotel room keys, stolen, rainy afternoons, and desperate, whispered secrets in the dark. It feels like a beautiful, reckless, terrible storm that you simply cannot control. A force of nature sweeping you away from your boring, predictable life. But I can tell you exactly what followed the storm, and I assure you, it was not romantic. What followed my affair did not feel like passionate, fiery, dramatic revenge. It felt exactly like an efficient, ruthless, and highly calculated corporate shutdown. It was as if I was a failing, bankrupt subsidiary company, and my husband was the stoic, unfeeling executive liquidating my remaining assets, freezing my shared credit lines, turning off my security access badges, and escorting me out of the shiny glass building with a sad cardboard box of my personal belongings. There was no chaotic, messy emotion. There was only cold, terrifying, bureaucratic procedure. I really should have known he would react exactly this way. I should have remembered the exact mettle and the sheer, unbroken strength of the man I married. Long before I ever betrayed him, my husband already knew exactly how to survive profound, unspeakable loss. Many years ago, long before we even bought our house, he had to survive his own failing, treacherous body. He had to sit in sterile, freezing hospital rooms and listen to serious doctors casually tell him what parts of him needed to be poisoned with chemicals and burned away with radiation so that the rest of him could survive a brutal, aggressive illness. He understood the grim concept of amputation on a deep, fundamental cellular level. He knew how to look directly at something that was actively killing him, accept the tragic reality of the situation, and calmly agree to cut it out without shedding a single, useless tear. I just never realized, in all my selfish, blinding delusion, that the exact same ruthless survival instinct would one day apply directly to me. When I became the toxic, spreading disease in his life, his response was just as precise, just as clinical, and entirely comprehensively devastating. The ultimate headline truth of my total destruction is incredibly simple, and it is profoundly, unforgivably ugly. I am carrying a child, but the child is not his. I am carrying my husband's younger brother's child. It is a betrayal so deep, so fundamentally grotesque and unnatural, that it sounds exactly like a cheap, trashy television plot, but it is my daily, waking nightmare. By the time the formal medical confirmation finally came back, by the time the indisputable biological reality was printed in stark black ink on crisp white paper, my husband had already begun the meticulous, unstoppable process of completely disappearing from my life. He did not wait for my tearful, shaking apologies. He did not wait for my desperate, sprawling, pathetic explanations. He asked a single, quiet question, received his awful, life-shattering answer, and immediately initiated a permanent, administrative erasure of my very existence from his world. I sit here now, feeling the unborn child roll and kick against my aching ribs, listening to the mechanical hum and the sudden hiss of the heavy dry cleaning machines churning away endlessly downstairs. I am completely alone, and I am deeply, physically terrified of the looming, uncertain future, but I will promise you this one fundamental truth. As the endless, agonizing weeks drag on and the harsh, biting reality of my situation settles deep into my aching bones, I am realizing the absolute worst part of this entire ordeal. The worst part was not losing the marriage itself. The worst part was not the overwhelming public humiliation, the sudden staggering financial ruin, or the terrifying, lonely prospect of single motherhood. The worst part was learning, entirely too late to ever change it, that the safe, comfortable, perfectly predictable life I thought I lived had been quietly, tirelessly built by a man I never truly understood. I foolishly mistook his quiet, steady stability for ordinary, suffocating boredom, I completely mistook his calm, peaceful silence for emotional absence. And by the time I finally saw him clearly, by the time I finally understood the sheer weight, the deep, towering intelligence, and the immense, quiet power of his grace, he was already long gone. I am 33 years old, and for the past 5 years, my entire professional life has been defined by pristine appearances and relentless, grinding pressure. I work as an operations manager for Halcyon Women's Care Network. If you live anywhere in the region, you have probably seen our targeted digital advertisements or driven past our sleek, modern buildings. Halcyon is a massive, highly profitable regional healthcare group famous for its polished, spa-like clinics featuring soothing water walls in the waiting rooms, expensive herbal tea stations, and soft, indirect lighting designed to make patients feel pampered. Behind those beautifully frosted glass doors, however, my daily reality was a non-stop, high-speed administrative nightmare. I spent 10 hours a day managing furious doctors, smoothing over catastrophic scheduling conflicts, fighting with aggressive insurance adjusters over billing codes, and ensuring that our pristine, empathetic brand image never cracked under the sheer volume of patients we processed. I was paid very well to manage chaos and make it look perfectly serene. My husband, Reed Calder, was exactly 38 years old, and his entire career was built on predicting disasters before they ever had the chance to happen. Reed was a senior risk engineer at Blue Meridian Infrastructure, a highly specialized, very quiet firm that audited the structural integrity of massive public works projects across the Southeast. He spent his days inspecting the invisible tension cables in suspension bridges, evaluating the concrete stress limits of municipal flood barriers, and analyzing emergency construction systems for critical flaws. Reed was a man whose entire worldview was based on load-bearing capacities and preventative maintenance. He was incredibly steady, deeply disciplined, and universally respected by his peers. More than anything else, Reed was emotionally economical. He simply did not waste energy on loud outbursts, dramatic gestures, or performative affection. He was the kind of man who spent 2 hours every single Sunday afternoon in our kitchen, methodically chopping vegetables and weighing lean proteins to meal prep identical lunches for the entire work week. He was the kind of man who climbed a stepladder on the first day of every single January to replace the batteries in all 8 of our smoke detectors without me ever having to ask or remind him. He never, ever forgot a utility due date, an anniversary, or an oil change. He operated on a quiet, unbreakable rhythm. Our environment perfectly reflected that solid, unwavering foundation. We lived in a stunning, meticulously restored craftsman house tucked away in a quiet, fiercely protective neighborhood full of mature oak trees and manicured lawns. It had wide, sweeping porches, thick original woodwork, and a sprawling, sunlit kitchen where I spent my weekends aggressively curating the perfect aesthetic of domestic bliss. I bought expensive linen throw pillows, ordered custom window treatments, and planted hydrangeas along the front walkway. I poured my heart into decorating every single room, and because of that emotional investment, the place felt entirely, undeniably like ours. I deliberately, blissfully ignored the cold, hard paperwork. The house was legally tied to a Calder family property trust, an ironclad legal structure Reed had inherited several years before we even met. Because he seamlessly handled the property taxes, the insurance premiums, and the trust compliance documents, I simply never thought about whose name actually owned the ground I walked on. Living inside that beautiful house, our marriage was not a miserable war zone. It was not physically or emotionally abusive. It was not chaotic, and it certainly was not dead. It was just profoundly, increasingly, suffocatingly predictable. Our evening conversations slowly shrank, shedding layers of intimacy until they were nothing more than highly efficient status reports between 2 exhausted co-managers. "Did you remember to call the plumber about the guest bathroom sink?" I would ask, staring at my phone on the sofa. "Yes, he is coming on Thursday between 2 and 4 in the afternoon," Reed would reply, not looking up from his laptop. "We also need to buy more laundry detergent and heavy-duty trash bags." And then, Always hovering at the very edge of those mundane lists was the heavy, unspoken weight of our future. We really need to look at the calendar and reschedule the fertility consultation, one of us would eventually say, usually late at night when the house was too quiet. But we kept postponing it, week after week, month after month. The clinical appointments, the sterile waiting rooms, and the terrifying prospect of discussing reproductive failure simply felt too heavy for the perfectly balanced, low-friction life we were desperately trying to maintain. It was much easier to focus on the grocery list, and then there was Wyatt. Reed's younger brother, Wyatt Calder, was 31 years old, but he moved through the world with the restless, hungry energy of a man constantly auditioning for a much better, much wealthier life. Wyatt was a stark, jarring contrast to my husband. Where Reed was concrete and steel, Wyatt was smoke and mirrors. Wyatt always arrived smelling of expensive, spicy cologne that lingered in our hallway fabrics for hours. He had a blinding, perfectly practiced grin that he used like a weapon to disarm people. He talked endlessly and passionately about luxury commercial real estate, massive zoning loopholes, and grand multi-million-dollar development plans that always seemed incredibly urgent but never, ever seemed fully stable or real. Wyatt drifted in and out of our restored craftsman house with the easy, entitled familiarity of a favored guest who refuses to leave. He would show up unannounced on a Tuesday evening to borrow an expensive power drill from Reed's pristine garage, claiming his was broken. He would drop by on a Thursday afternoon, letting himself in through the kitchen door, just to use the heavy-duty laser printer in Reed's home office, because he needed to print a 40-page glossy prospectus for a client, and his own printer was conveniently out of toner. He almost always ended up staying for dinner, and Wyatt made me laugh. He made me laugh loudly, freely, and often, leaning across the granite island in our kitchen to tell ridiculous, highly embellished stories about his arrogant clients and his chaotic social life. He noticed when I changed my hair. He noticed when I bought a new dress. He engaged with me, teased me, and paid attention to my moods in ways that Reed no longer seemed interested in trying to do. While Wyatt and I drank expensive red wine and traded sharp, sarcastic jokes, Reed would simply sit at the head of the dining table, chewing his perfectly portioned food slowly, watching his younger brother with a look of mild, exhausted tolerance. Reed firmly believed that keeping Wyatt close, keeping him fed, and allowing him to utilize our home as a chaotic base of operations was simply the responsible, moral thing to do. Reed looked at his brother and saw a reckless, impulsive, but ultimately salvageable man who just needed a strong anchor to keep from drifting out to sea. Reed felt a deep, unspoken familial duty to be that anchor. I watched Reed quietly absorb Wyatt's unpaid parking tickets, his sudden changes in career paths, and his endless, exhausting monologues, and I completely misread the situation. I mistook my husband's deep, protective instinct for passivity. I looked at his quiet, unwavering patience, and I foolishly, arrogantly, labeled it as weakness. In the quiet, lonely spaces between my demanding job and my predictable marriage, I started telling myself a very specific, incredibly dangerous lie. As I lay in bed at night, listening to the perfectly measured, even sound of Reed breathing beside me, I started whispering to myself that basic gratitude is absolutely not the same thing as passionate love. I convinced myself that having a safe, beautiful house, a husband who never raised his voice, and a bank account that never dipped into the red was not enough. I convinced myself that physical and financial safety is not the same thing as being truly, deeply, and hungrily seen by a man. I convinced myself I was dying of thirst, completely ignoring the fact that I was standing in the middle of a perfectly engineered, flood-proof fortress that my husband had built entirely to keep me safe. The late summer brought an exceptionally brutal coastal storm season that battered the eastern seaboard, tearing up highways, compromising bridges, and flooding municipal command centers. Because of his specialized expertise, my husband was immediately assigned to a massive 4-month emergency infrastructure review. It was a mandatory deployment. He packed his structured canvas duffel bags with his usual quiet efficiency, methodically rolling his shirts and organizing his heavy work boots. He stood in the front hallway, holding his keys, and gave me the logistical breakdown of our new reality. "I will be rotating through 5 different coastal counties," he told me, his tone perfectly level and professional. "I should be back for 2 days every other weekend, but the assessment schedule is highly volatile. I have already set the security system to run on the perimeter mode at night." "I understand," I told him, smoothing the lapel of his jacket. "Be safe on the sights." His departure left me completely alone in our large, echoing house for long, uninterrupted stretches of time. Without his quiet, grounding presence, the pristine rooms felt remarkably hollow. The absolute silence of the evenings became a heavy, physical weight pressing down on my chest. I tried to fill the empty hours with extra work for the clinics, but the isolation was a slow, creeping cold that I could not shake. That was exactly when Wyatt began bridging the gap, stepping into the empty spaces his brother left behind. He started showing up at the house far more frequently, always armed with incredibly practical, entirely plausible excuses that made it impossible for me to turn him away. "I was driving past your neighborhood and figured you did not want to cook a full dinner just for one person," he would say, standing on the front porch with a charming grin and 2 large brown paper bags of aromatic Thai takeout. On a suffocatingly humid Tuesday evening, he appeared in the backyard in worn denim jeans and a fitted shirt. "Reed texted me from the coast and asked me to finally fix that flickering patio light," he explained, holding a toolbox he had clearly borrowed from my own garage. He said it was a security liability. We quickly developed a remarkably easy, incredibly private rhythm. The formal boundaries of our relationship began to blur, softening into something dangerously comfortable. We spent countless evenings sitting side by side on the warm brick steps of the back patio, drinking crisp white wine and watching the fireflies move through the heavy southern air. Our conversations felt intensely thrilling, charged with a subtle, electric current, precisely because we continuously framed them as perfectly harmless. We were just family, keeping each other company. We were just 2 people sharing a drink, but Wyatt offered me a specific, intoxicating kind of validation that I was completely starved for. He flattered me in ways my husband never even attempted. Wyatt actively noticed me. He noticed the slight, tired drop of my shoulders after a brutal 10-hour shift. He noticed when I wore my hair down instead of pulling it back into a severe, professional knot. He noticed the expensive silk blouses I bought to make myself feel powerful in corporate meetings. "You always look like you are carrying the entire world on your shoulders, Stella," he murmured one evening, swirling the wine in his glass and watching me with dark, unreadable eyes. "You do not have to be the responsible one all the time. It must be exhausting, being so perfectly managed." He saw the deep, restless loneliness that I had been rigorously trying to discipline out of myself for years. I was overwhelmingly drawn to his attention, but I was drawn even more to the dangerous, exhilarating fantasy he represented. When I was with Wyatt, I did not have to be the efficient co-manager of a domestic corporation. I could be impulsive. I could be reckless. I was profoundly seduced by the idea that I was still inherently desirable, still capable of being chosen strictly for heat, passion, and excitement, rather than being chosen simply because I was dependable and had good credit. The defining fracture, the absolute point of no return, happened late on a Saturday night following a massive, high-profile charity gala I had spent 6 agonizing months organizing for the healthcare network. The event had been a grueling, high-stakes marathon of forced smiles and corporate networking, raising over $200,000 for a new maternal ward. I had spent 8 hours in high heels, managing arrogant donors and smoothing over catering disasters. Reed was stranded 300 miles away in a coastal motel, reviewing concrete stress reports. When I finally arrived home just before midnight, I was completely exhausted, buzzing with leftover adrenaline, deeply resentful of my husband's absence, and warm from 3 glasses of expensive champagne. I walked into the dark house, dropped my keys onto the console table, and found Wyatt sitting casually in the living room. He had used his spare key. He said he wanted to make sure I got home safely. I stood there in my form-fitting emerald evening gown, my feet aching, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I was so incredibly hungry to feel like the absolute center of someone's world, to be the most important thing in a room, even if just for one night. Wyatt stood up, crossed the Persian rug, and looked at me with a raw, undisguised hunger that stripped away all my practiced, professional defenses. He reached out and touched the bare skin of my shoulder, and I simply leaned into the fire. The affair lasted for exactly 11 weeks. It was a breathless, chaotic sprint of stolen moments and shattering compromises. We booked anonymous hotel rooms out by the interstate, charging them under the convenient guise of Wyatt's vague real estate travel expenses. We spent frantic, rushed afternoons tangled together in the very house my husband painstakingly maintained, jumping at the sound of every passing delivery truck. It was a period of intense moral slippage, driven entirely by a relentless cycle of self-deception. We kept making hushed, desperate promises in the dark, swearing to each other that we would stop after just one more time. But one more time always bled into the next week, and the lies became easier to swallow. I need to be ruthlessly honest about my complicity. I was absolutely not manipulated into that bed. Wyatt did not trick me, he did not force me, and he did not trap me. I walked into the destruction of my own life with my eyes wide open, actively cooperating with my own ruin because it felt temporarily better than the creeping silent boredom of my marriage. I wanted the danger. I wanted the spark. And that total, undeniable willingness makes every single moment of the fallout infinitely harder to excuse or justify. But there was a darker secondary betrayal running parallel to our secret hotel rooms. A truth I was completely, foolishly blind to at the time. While I was risking my entire future for the thrill of Wyatt's attention, he was simultaneously leaning harder and harder on my husband for survival. During those exact same 11 weeks, while Wyatt was whispering promises into my skin, he was quietly draining thousands of dollars from Reed to cover his own catastrophic financial mistakes. I was sleeping with a man who was using my husband's money to pay for the very life he used to seduce me. A devastating reality I would not uncover until it was far too late to save anyone. When my cycle was 5 days late, I blamed the sheer, suffocating stress of the previous 2 months. I told myself that the constant, grinding pressure of my job and the heavy, humid summer heat were simply distorting my body's natural rhythm. By the time I was 9 days late, however, a cold, metallic dread began pooling at the base of my throat, making it difficult to swallow. I sat on the edge of the guest bathroom tub, staring blankly at a plastic stick I had purchased from a brightly lit pharmacy at 2 a.m. I kept telling myself I was being completely irrational. A pregnancy was a biological impossibility. Years earlier, the heavy, aggressive doses of chemotherapy and radiation that had ultimately saved my husband's life had thoroughly scorched his reproductive system. We had sat together in a freezing oncologist's office and listened to a specialist gently but firmly explain that natural conception was practically off the table. Our chances hovered somewhere around less than 1%. But as I sat there on the cold porcelain tiles, gripping the edge of the bathtub until my knuckles turned white, the digital display flashed the word pregnant in stark, undeniable black letters. My entire body went completely numb, freezing me in a state of sheer, absolute terror. I walked slowly downstairs with the plastic stick hidden deep inside my pocket, my mind frantically calculating dates, times, and hotel receipts, desperate to find a mathematical loophole that would save me. I handed the test to Reed in the kitchen, standing by the granite island. For a brief, terrifying second, I waited for the analytical risk engineer to crunch the numbers, assess the biological improbability, and instantly see the ugly lie. Instead, a profound, completely uncharacteristic joy washed over his entire face, softening every hard line of his jaw. He did not question the math. He called it an absolute miracle. Within 48 hours, he shifted entirely into high-speed planning mode. He spent his evenings methodically measuring the dimensions of the spare bedroom on the second floor, calculating the exact square footage required for a crib, a changing table, and a rocking chair. He spent his Sunday mornings researching the premium tiers on his employer's health insurance policy and compiling a detailed spreadsheet of top-rated pediatricians in our zip code. His sheer, unadulterated happiness made my internal panic infinitely worse, but for a few desperate, cowardly days, I allowed myself to hide inside his joy. I convinced myself that perhaps, against all astronomical odds, the universe had actually granted us a 1 in a million medical anomaly. I let myself believe the sheer improbability of the situation might actually save me from the catastrophic, life-ruining consequences of my own actions. Because of his extensive medical history, our primary care physician immediately referred us to a high-risk obstetric specialist at a prestigious downtown clinic. At my 6-week scan, the doctor sat across from us in a sterile, brightly lit examination room and outlined a rigorous, highly monitored prenatal protocol. He explained that due to the previous oncology treatments and the inherent, lingering risks of cellular damage, he strongly recommended expanded prenatal genetic screening. He specifically wanted to run a comprehensive paternal marker review far earlier than standard procedure dictated, just to definitively ensure the fetus was developing without any compromised genetic material from the past radiation exposure. Reed agreed without a single moment of hesitation, signing the consent forms with his heavy silver pen. He sat beside me in the dim ultrasound room, his eyes fixed on the grainy black and white monitor. When the technician handed him the glossy thermal printout of the scan, he held it with both hands, his thumbs gently framing the edges as if it were already a cherished, framed family photograph. Looking at his strong, steady hands holding the image of a child that I knew, deep down, might not belong to him, the crushing weight of my guilt nearly suffocated me. The words of a full, weeping confession rose rapidly up my throat, choking me, but I swallowed them back down right before the doctor flipped the fluorescent lights back on. 4 agonizing weeks later, we were called back into that exact same sterile office. The air conditioning hummed loudly overhead, a mechanical, droning noise that sounded perfectly detached from the human suffering about to unfold beneath it. The specialist walked in holding a thick manila folder, his professional demeanor notably tight, guarded, and uneasy. He did not offer his usual warm smile. He did not offer congratulations. He sat down behind his large wooden desk, opened the file, and delivered the results with devastating clinical clarity. The genetic screening showed absolutely no abnormalities, but the paternal marker review revealed a massive, insurmountable discrepancy. The doctor folded his hands together and stated, clearly and unequivocally, that the DNA of the fetus completely lacked the specific, necessary genetic markers to be a biological match to my husband. The fetus could not biologically be his. The laboratory report formally recommended immediate legal paternity confirmation. It was not a suspicion. It was a medical verdict, delivered with the cold, hard finality of a gavel striking wood. The silence that immediately followed that pronouncement was absolute. It was so heavy and so incredibly dense that it felt like the sudden, terrifying loss of cabin pressure in a falling airplane. I squeezed my eyes shut, bracing my body for the inevitable violent explosion. I waited for my husband to scream, to flip the heavy mahogany desk, to tear the room apart with his bare hands. But Reed did absolutely nothing of the sort. He did not raise his voice by a single decibel. He leaned slightly forward in his leather chair and looked directly at the doctor. "What is the statistical certainty of this result?" he asked, his voice completely level and detached. "It is 99.9% conclusive," the doctor replied, looking deeply uncomfortable, his eyes darting briefly toward me before settling back on Reed. "Is there any possibility of a laboratory contamination or a sample switch during the testing process?" Reed asked, his tone still perfectly even, exactly the way he sounded when questioning a failing concrete stress test on a municipal bridge project. "None," the doctor said softly. "The chain of custody on the blood work is absolute. I am so incredibly sorry." Reed nodded once. He processed the data. He accepted the catastrophic, irreparable structural failure of his entire life without a single flinch, without a single wasted breath. Then, He slowly turned his head to look directly at me. His face was so incredibly still, so entirely drained of all human emotion, that it looked distinctly inhuman. It was a mask of pure, terrifying ice. His eyes were completely dark, completely hollow, stripping away every single layer of protection I thought I had. When he finally spoke, he did not ask how long the affair had been going on. He did not ask why I had done it. He did not ask where we had gone, or if I loved the other man. He looked at my terrified, trembling face and asked exactly 2 words. Which brother? In that single, agonizing instant, I understood that all my frantic, pathetic denial was permanently over. The absolute specificity of his question, the immediate, surgical precision of it, told me everything I needed to know. He had not been blind. He had seen the subtle shifts, the lingering looks across the dining table, the easy, inappropriate familiarity in our own backyard. He had already seen the dark, looming shape of the truth long before the medical paperwork confirmed it in black and white. I opened my mouth, but my lungs felt completely empty, as if all the oxygen had been vacuumed from the room. I forced the single name out of my throat, a dry, pathetic whisper that completely and permanently shattered the remaining pieces of our marriage. Wyatt! Reed's only visible reaction was a single, tight flex of his jaw muscle beneath his skin. He did not look at me again. He did not look at the ultrasound picture still sitting on the doctor's desk. He smoothly stood up from his chair, buttoned his suit jacket with perfectly steady, unshakable fingers, and looked back at the specialist. "Thank you for your time, doctor," he said quietly. Then he turned around and walked out of the room, leaving the heavy wooden door to click softly and definitively shut behind him. I followed him out of the medical building and down into the concrete parking garage in a heavy, suffocating daze, my mind completely blank. The drive back to our quiet, tree-lined neighborhood took exactly 42 minutes. For the entire duration of that torturous ride, he did not speak a single word. He did not grip the leather steering wheel with white, trembling knuckles. He did not press his foot down heavily on the accelerator. He did not swerve between lanes, and he did not aggressively run a single yellow light. He drove with his usual infuriatingly calm precision, keeping his eyes fixed straight ahead on the busy road. I sat frozen in the passenger seat, my hands resting protectively over my stomach, waiting in sheer terror for the inevitable, violent explosion. I practically begged the universe for a screaming match. I desperately wanted him to pull the vehicle over to the shoulder, slam his hands against the dashboard, and demand to know exactly how many times I had slept with his own blood. I wanted him to call me every terrible, unforgivable name I deserved, but he did not touch me. He did not look at me, not even for a fraction of a second. When he finally put the car in park in our driveway, he simply turned off the ignition, unbuckled his seatbelt, and walked inside the house. The complete, absolute absence of drama, the utter lack of any human friction, felt infinitely more frightening than any physical threat he could have ever made. Within exactly 48 hours of that silent car ride, the true devastating machinery of his revenge was fully activated. I was served at the healthcare clinic on a Tuesday afternoon. A deeply apologetic process server wearing a cheap gray suit walked right into the pristine halcyon waiting room, bypassed the soothing water wall, and handed me a thick, heavy envelope. Inside was a rigorously drafted, court-approved paternity order demanding a legally binding DNA test upon the birth of the child. It was seamlessly paired with a comprehensive petition for dissolution of marriage. The paperwork was not filed by a standard, friendly neighborhood lawyer. He had retained a senior partner at the most ruthless, expensive family law firm located squarely in the downtown financial district. The documents did not cite the lurid, ugly details of infidelity. They coldly cited irreconcilable differences, utilizing dense, procedural language that entirely stripped away the deeply personal, profoundly humiliating nature of my betrayal. I was not a cheating wife in those pages. I was simply a liability being legally and efficiently mitigated. When I drove home that evening, the brass locks on the front door were exactly the same. but the invisible infrastructure of my life had been completely and systematically dismantled. I opened my laptop on the sofa to check our shared checking account, only to find my digital credentials entirely invalid. I tried logging into the joint savings portal, the household credit card dashboard, and the comprehensive health insurance network. Access denied flashed over and over again in stark red lettering across the screen. By 7 o'clock that night, an automated email coldly informed me that I had been formally removed as his emergency contact across all medical and human resources platforms. He was systematically cutting every single wire that connected us to one another. I found the real, suffocating blow sitting squarely in the center of the kitchen island. It was a thick, black, heavy-duty binder. It was meticulously labeled with printed text, perfectly highlighted in bright yellow ink, and comprehensively cross-referenced with colorful sticky tabs. I opened it with trembling, freezing fingers. Inside was the absolute, indisputable proof of my impending ruin. For years, I had happily decorated the walls, picked out expensive tile, and planted the front gardens, completely ignoring the complex legal reality of our living situation. I had foolishly assumed the house was ours. The binder contained the original Calder family trust documents, the premarital equity statements, and the strict property tax records dating back over a decade. It outlined, with brutal, undeniable clarity, that the house was never marital property in the legal sense. It belonged entirely to the trust. Reed was simply the sole beneficiary and the acting trustee. Tucked into the very front pocket of the binder was a formal 30-day occupancy notice. Because the house was completely shielded from the standard divorce proceedings, he was reclaiming exclusive possession of his property with brutal efficiency once the legal filing began. He had provided the exact, flawless paper trail that prevented me from contesting the house in any meaningful way. I had absolutely no legal standing to remain in the only home I cared about. Over the next 14 days, Reed essentially turned himself into a ghost. He instructed his employer to immediately transfer him to their regional headquarters located far away in Denver, Colorado. He systematically declined all upcoming social invitations without offering any excuses, removed his presence from every shared professional network, and permanently changed his mobile phone number. He closed every single casual, accidental path I might have ever used to reach him or beg for forgiveness. Wyatt, driven by a frantic, pathetic mix of guilt and wounded ego, tried to intervene. He sent long, rambling apology emails that instantly bounced back as undeliverable. He tried to ambush Reed at his favorite downtown coffee shop, but Reed simply stopped going there. Finally, Wyatt tried to force a dramatic, emotional conversation at the Blue Meridian Infrastructure corporate office. He walked right into the sleek lobby, demanding to see his older brother, only to find that the building security team was already intimately aware of his name and his face. They calmly escorted Wyatt back out to the hot concrete sidewalk under the direct threat of a formal trespassing charge. Reed never sent a single text message to call me a whore. He never sent Wyatt a single angry, threatening email. He never insulted either of us. He simply withdrew his recognition, his legal access, and his physical presence so thoroughly and completely that I started to feel like I had been administratively erased from the earth. I was drowning, and he had simply stepped back from the water edge to watch me sink. The final crushing realization came on a quiet Saturday morning. I woke up just after 5 o'clock, the early sunlight filtering softly through the custom window treatments I had painstakingly ordered 2 years ago. The house was unnervingly, profoundly silent. Foundly. I walked slowly down the hardwood hallway and realized the door to his home office was wide open. The large mahogany desk was completely clear of all files and electronics. I opened the master bedroom closet and saw that his heavy winter coats, his tailored suits, and his perfectly polished leather shoes were entirely gone. He had packed his bags, loaded his vehicle, and moved out long before dawn. He took absolutely nothing that belonged to me, claiming only what was indisputably his. He left the house immaculate, the granite counters wiped down, and the floors perfectly swept. He disappeared before I even realized he was awake, leaving me completely alone, heavily pregnant, and standing in a perfectly clean house that I was legally mandated to vacate in exactly 16 days. With my legally mandated departure date looming, I packed the very few personal belongings that indisputably belonged to me into a rented moving van and drove across the city to Wyatt's upscale apartment building. I had visited his place a handful of times before everything imploded, always marveling at the floor-to-ceiling windows, the modern fixtures, and the sleek minimalist aesthetic that seemed so cosmopolitan compared to the heavy, historic weight of the home I was leaving behind. I had desperately clung to the expectation that we were at least going to build some version of the exciting, high-stakes future he had constantly implied we would share. I told myself that moving into his space was the painful but necessary first step into our new, authentic life together. That fragile illusion completely shattered within my first 48 hours of living there. The reality of Wyatt's glamorous lifestyle was not a solid structure. It was a rapidly collapsing house of cards, held together by sheer panic and rented velvet. I discovered the truth entirely by accident on a Tuesday afternoon. I was searching through a sleek, modern credenza in the living room, simply looking for a spare charging cable for my phone. Instead, shoved hastily beneath a stack of glossy real estate magazines, I found a disorganized pile of mail. At the very top were two violently pink final notice envelopes from the municipal utility company. Beneath those was a collections warning from a high-end furniture rental service. My stomach dropped as I read the itemized invoice. The plush charcoal gray sectional sofa I was currently sitting on, the heavy glass dining table, even the stylized brass floor lamps, none of it was actually his. He was paying $345 a month just to lease the appearance of success. A sick, cold dread settled over me, and I started digging deeper into the messy drawer. I found his current lease agreement. He had proudly told me he had secured a 3-year lock on the penthouse-level unit. The document in my trembling hands clearly stated he was on a precarious, highly elevated month-to-month rate, and he was currently 16 days past due on his rent. But the absolute worst discoveries, the pieces of paper that truly made me want to vomit, were the ones bearing my husband's name. As I sifted through the crumpled bank statements and legal notices, a horrifying, undeniable pattern emerged. Wyatt's income from his commercial real estate ventures was incredibly erratic. His commissions were shockingly thin, completely devoured by massive gaps of unemployment between meager closings. His entire polished, arrogant lifestyle had been quietly, systematically propped up by Reed for years. I found copies of wire transfers labeled as temporary loans that were never, ever repaid. I found the vehicle financing agreement for Wyatt's incredibly expensive, imported sports car. Reed was listed as the primary co-signer. I found a complex string of emails regarding an aggressive state tax lien Wyatt had incurred 3 years ago. Reed had completely cleared the balance. There was even a receipt from a powerful corporate attorney who had quietly settled an old, potentially career-ending licensing complaint against Wyatt. Most humiliating of all, I found the original move-in paperwork for the very apartment I was currently standing inside. When Wyatt had first moved into this luxury high-rise, he had spun a complex, convincing story about a delayed commission check from a massive commercial closing. In reality, Reed had quietly wired the massive $5,000 security deposit and the first 2 months of rent just to keep his younger brother from getting evicted from his previous complex. I sat on the rented sofa, clutching the thin, damning pieces of paper, and realized with absolute, crushing horror that the effortless swagger I had been so desperately drawn to had been entirely financed by the very man he had betrayed. Wyatt did not possess any inherent power, stability, or ambition. He was simply wearing a very expensive costume, and Reed had been quietly paying the tailor the entire time. When Wyatt finally came home that evening, smelling of his signature spicy cologne and carrying a leather briefcase that I now knew was completely empty of any actual contracts, I confronted him. I expected shame. I expected a frantic apology. Instead, he instantly deployed the same slippery, deflective charm he used on hesitant clients. "You are overreacting, Stella," he insisted, loosening his silk tie and pouring himself a glass of expensive bourbon that I suddenly realized he could not afford. The market is just experiencing a temporary seasonal dip. I am already putting the pieces together to launch my own boutique brokerage by the end of the year. We are going to flip a distressed property down in the historic district next month, use the equity, and maybe even move down to Charleston after the baby comes. We just need to ride out this minor cash flow issue. None of it was anchored in reality. It was just a frantic stream of buzzwords and grand, empty promises designed to stop me from asking harder questions. But the hard questions were rapidly becoming physical necessities. My pregnancy was progressing, bringing with it a mountain of specialized high-risk medical bills. My steady paycheck from the healthcare network suddenly became our only reliable lifeline. Within a month, the claustrophobic dynamic of our new life was firmly established. I started covering the mundane, grinding costs of our survival. I paid $180 at the grocery store every Sunday so we had food to eat. I paid the $200 electric bill so the light stayed on. I covered my $75 specialist copays out of my own depleted savings. Meanwhile, Wyatt stubbornly refused to alter his lifestyle. He kept spending money on appearance and image maintenance, desperate to feel bigger than the suffocating reality we were actually living in. He would come home with a brand new pair of $400 Italian leather loafers, claiming he needed to project success to attract high-wealth investors, while I was carefully calculating if I could afford to buy generic prenatal vitamins instead of the name brand. The suffocating pressure inevitably boiled over into our first truly explosive fight. It happened on a Thursday night in the cramped, galley-style kitchen. I had just finished paying his overdue vehicle insurance premium online because the company had threatened to suspend his license. I closed my laptop, turned to him, and finally asked the question that had been burning a hole in my chest for weeks. "Why was Reed paying all of your bills?" I asked, my voice shaking with a potent mixture of exhaustion and disgust. The taxes, the car, the apartment deposit. Why were you letting him carry you? Wyatt slammed his glass down onto the quartz countertop so hard I thought the stem would shatter. His handsome face twisted into a deeply ugly defensive sneer, stripping away the last remnants of the charming boy I thought I knew. "Because he liked it," Wyatt snapped, his voice venomous and loud. "He absolutely loved it." Reed liked being the stoic, responsible hero. He needed me to be the screw-up, so he could feel superior. It made him feel powerful to write those checks. Stella. He was controlling me. I stared at him, absolutely paralyzed by the sheer, breathtaking delusion of his response. In a single breath, he had completely exposed the deep, festering resentment and the pathetic, infantile dependence that defined his entire existence. He actually hated his brother for saving him. He resented the hand that fed him, precisely because he knew he was entirely incapable of feeding himself. I turned away from him and walked into the small bedroom, quietly closing the door behind me. I lay down on the rented mattress, staring up at the ceiling in the dark. The final, brutal truth of my situation settled over me like a heavy lead blanket. For weeks, I had been terrified that Reed was actively plotting to destroy Wyatt out of vengeance. But I finally understood the terrifying genius of my husband's departure. Reed did not ruin Wyatt. Reed did not actively destroy his business, sabotage his credit, or spread malicious rumors about his character. My husband simply stopped paying the invoices. He stopped co-signing the loans. He stopped acting as the invisible safety net beneath his brother's reckless, chaotic, high-wire act. Reed did not push Wyatt off the ledge. He simply let go of the rope. And I was now permanently tied to a man who was entirely incapable of breaking his own fall. I spent the first few weeks after my husband departed bracing myself for a spectacular, vicious social execution. I lay awake in Wyatt's rented bed every night, staring at the dark ceiling, fully expecting Reed to wage a massive scorched earth campaign across our entire social network. I waited for the angry text messages from mutual friends, the furious emails from extended family members, and the cold, professional backlash at my workplace. I thought he would broadcast my unforgivable sins to anyone who would listen, ensuring my reputation was entirely reduced to ash. But the reality of my social ruin was far more terrifying and far more efficient. He said almost absolutely nothing, and yet, every single person still chose him over me. Wyatt, driven by a frantic, deeply delusional optimism, insisted that we needed to face his parents head-on. He firmly believed he could smooth the entire catastrophe over, utilizing his slick real estate charm to frame our betrayal as a complicated, unavoidable tragedy of two desperate people falling in love. We drove out to their quiet, perfectly manicured suburban home on a humid Sunday afternoon. Wyatt smelled overwhelmingly of his expensive, spicy cologne, but underneath it, he smelled of raw panic. It was the absolute shortest, most devastating visit of my entire life. We sat stiffly on their floral living room sofa. Reed's mother, a woman who had once baked me a birthday cake from scratch, did not offer us iced tea or water. She did not even lift her eyes to look at my face. She simply stared intently at her own trembling hands resting in her lap. Reed's father, a formidable man who shared my husband's solid, unmovable jawline and strict moral compass, stood rigid by the brick fireplace. He looked down at Wyatt, his face etched with a deep, sickening disgust that seemed to age him 10 years in a single moment. He did not yell. He asked only one single, lethal question. "Did he protect you your whole life just so you could do this?" Wyatt opened his mouth, raising his hands to stammer out a pathetic excuse, but his father just raised a single finger, pointed it directly toward the heavy oak front door, and told us both to leave immediately. They cut Wyatt off completely, both emotionally and financially. Effective that very second, my own family offered absolutely no sanctuary from the fallout. Initially, my older sister tried her best to defend me. She argued with our relatives that marriages are inherently complex, claiming that Reed was always far too emotionally distant and that I was simply a lonely woman who made a desperate mistake. But then, during a strained telephone conversation, she asked me for the exact timeline of the affair. When I finally stopped lying and confessed that the secret hotel rooms overlapped perfectly with Reed's extended coastal engineering deployment and that the child growing inside me was undeniably Wyatt's, her fragile defense evaporated completely. She fell entirely silent on the line. After that day, she simply stopped calling. My mother did not sever ties entirely, but her communication devolved into short, brittle phone calls that rarely lasted longer than 3 or 4 minutes. Her voice did not hold fiery, screaming anger. It held a heavy, suffocating exhaustion, as if the mere act of speaking to her disgraced daughter physically drained her life force. The profound isolation followed me directly into the polished, sterile corridors of Halcyon Women's Care Network. In a corporate environment meticulously built around the lucrative brand of profound female empathy, holistic wellness, and maternal support, my increasingly visible pregnancy became a toxic, moving scandal. Nobody ever openly accused me of anything. Nobody shouted at me in the employee break room or left nasty notes on my mahogany desk. But the subtle, freezing exclusions were everywhere, hanging heavy in the air-conditioned air. My weekly Tuesday lunch invitations to the upscale organic bistro across the street quietly vanished. Whenever I walked into the staff kitchenette to pour a cup of decaffeinated coffee, the lively side conversations instantly stopped, replaced by tight, forced smiles and sudden, intense interests in mobile phone screens. I was a pariah in a perfectly tailored maternity blazer, wandering through a clinic built for mothers, entirely shunned by the women I worked alongside. Wyatt, completely incapable of managing his own mounting guilt and financial terror quietly, managed to make the situation exponentially worse for both of us. One Friday night, feeling totally suffocated by his crushing debts and his sudden excommunication from his family, he drank far too much expensive bourbon at a crowded, popular downtown bar. Instead of calling a taxi and going home to our cramped apartment, he cornered a group of local commercial real estate brokers and launched into a slurred, highly defensive, deeply self-pitying monologue. He desperately tried to frame himself as a noble victim of circumstance, spinning a pathetic, rewritten narrative about how my marriage to Reed was already completely dead and he was simply trying to rescue a miserable woman. He told this messy, humiliating story to the exact wrong people. The vicious gossip moved through the city faster than a seasonal wildfire. It spread farther and wider in 48 hours than Reed ever could have spread it himself, entirely confirming every terrible rumor anyone had ever whispered about us. I learned during those grueling, lonely months that silence can be deeply, lethally contagious. Because Reed flatly refused to perform the expected dramatic role of the outraged, screaming victim, everyone else read his absolute restraint, assessed the situation, and reached their own devastating conclusions. One late Wednesday afternoon, I ran into a former neighborhood friend in the produce aisle of a premium grocery store. She was the woman who had helped me pick out the hydrangeas for my front walkway 2 years prior. She looked deeply uncomfortable, her eyes darting nervously toward my swelling stomach. Before she hurried away toward the dairy section, she quietly told me that Reed had never once trashed my name to the neighbors. He had never called anyone to complain, seek sympathy, or build a coalition against me. He had simply, quietly removed himself from all our shared social circles. She looked at me with a potent mixture of pity and revulsion, and I realized in that crushing moment that his incredible restraint made me look infinitely worse. If he had screamed and thrown my belongings into the street, I could have been a flawed woman in a messy, mutual fight. Because he stayed perfectly silent and walked away with clean hands, I was simply a monster he had to escape. By the time the final divorce decree was stamped and formally filed into the county records, I realized the true, staggering scope of my loss. I was not just losing a legal marriage to a good man. I was permanently losing the entire, carefully curated version of myself that had once moved so comfortably, so confidently through my own city. I was no longer the respected healthcare operations manager or the elegant wife hosting sophisticated charity dinners. I was a cautionary tale, stripped of all my former grace. The absolute culmination of that agonizing public shame happened on my final legally mandated day at the Calder property. I stood alone on the pristine front lawn, the humid morning air pressing against my skin. My hands rested heavily on my belly as I watched a team of hired movers forcefully load the very last of my cheap cardboard boxes into a rumbling, diesel-choked truck. The beautiful, restored Craftsman house stood proud and silent behind me, its wide porches and perfect paint looking exactly as they did the day I first moved in, completely untouched and unbothered by my permanent absence. I glanced across the quiet street and saw the subtle, unmistakable shift of expensive linen curtains. My former neighbors were standing perfectly still behind their tasteful front windows, pretending not to stare, silently watching the disgraced woman finally leave the beautiful neighborhood she had so selfishly and thoroughly destroyed. The brutal, undeniable consequence of my choices finally arrived in the form of a 28-hour labor that systematically stripped away the very last, lingering traces of glamour from my affair. There were no soft shadows, no whispered promises, and absolutely no romance in that freezing hospital delivery room. There was only blinding fluorescent light, the terrifying rhythmic beeping of fetal heart monitors, and a level of sheer bodily agony that completely obliterated everything except the primal instinct to survive. When my son, Milo, was finally pulled into the world, screaming and covered in the messy, visceral reality of birth, I felt a crushing wave of love instantly eclipsed by a suffocating permanent terror. I was entirely responsible for this fragile, breathing life, and I had built his foundation on absolute ruin. Wyatt was physically present in the room, but his presence was completely, fundamentally hollow. He paced the linoleum floor wearing a wrinkled designer button-down shirt, looking incredibly pale and entirely out of his depth. He was spiritually unreliable in a way that became glaringly obvious the moment the situation demanded selflessness. During the hardest hours of my contractions, he kept stepping out into the hallway to check his mobile phone, defensively claiming he needed to monitor a volatile commercial property lead. When a tired nurse finally handed him his newborn son so they could adjust my intravenous lines, Wyatt held Milo far away from his chest, his arms stiff, looking at the crying infant like he was holding a fragile, ticking bomb. The very second the reality of fatherhood shifted from a charming, abstract concept into a messy, demanding, unromantic physical requirement, I watched Wyatt actively shrink away from the weight of it. The first 3 months inside that cramped, leased apartment were a relentless, hallucinatory nightmare of sleep deprivation. My entire existence was violently compressed into an endless, punishing loop of 2-ounce bottle feedings, washing mountains of soiled laundry in a cheap communal machine down the hall, and frantic pediatric appointments I had to navigate entirely alone. The heavy, suffocating stress of our financial ruin compounded the physical exhaustion. Because Wyatt's grand promises of boutique brokerages and massive real estate commissions never materialized, his income remained completely non-existent. I had absolutely no choice but to return to my demanding administrative job at the healthcare network at exactly 6 weeks postpartum. My body was still actively bleeding, my chest ached constantly, and my mind was entirely shattered. But the rent was due on the first day of the month, and the man sleeping soundly beside me was entirely incapable of paying it. Wyatt absolutely loved the superficial aesthetic of being a father, but he deeply, fiercely resented the actual, grinding labor of being one. He loved pushing the expensive, imported stroller we had bought on a high-interest credit card through the sunny downtown parks on a Saturday afternoon, soaking in the approving smiles of passing strangers. But he vanished the moment the audience disappeared. I recognized his profound failure in a series of crushingly ordinary domestic moments. I recognized it when I woke up at 3 a.m. to a screaming infant, only to discover Wyatt had completely forgotten to buy the specialized formula on his way home from a networking dinner. He simply rolled over in bed, pulled the heavy duvet over his shoulder, and mumbled that he thought I had bought some on Tuesday. I had to bundle a crying, hungry baby into a cold car seat and drive to a 24-hour convenience store simply because I could not trust the man I lived with to execute a basic life-sustaining task. I recognized it when utility disconnection notices started arriving again because he used the money I gave him for bills to buy a new tailored suit he swore he needed for an upcoming pitch. In the darkest, quietest hours of the night, while I sat in a cheap rocking chair trying to soothe Milo back to sleep, the involuntary flashes of my former life began to haunt me. The comparisons were absolutely inescapable, tearing through my mind like jagged glass. I would look at the wooden crib Wyatt had hastily assembled in the corner of the room. It wobbled dangerously whenever I leaned against it, because he had grown impatient and skipped a crucial step in the instruction manual. I would instantly picture Reed's strong, steady hands. My husband would have used a digital level. He would have checked every single metal screw twice. He would have actively researched the manufacturer for safety recalls before even bringing the box inside the house. When Milo developed a mild, terrifying fever, Wyatt panicked and yelled at me to fix it. Reed would have already memorized the exact dosage instructions from the pediatrician. He would have calmly administered the medicine, and he would have stayed awake the entire night tracking the baby's temperature on a perfectly organized notepad. I had traded a man who anticipated disasters to protect me for a man who actively created disasters and demanded I clean them up. Driven by a toxic, heavy mixture of profound postpartum shame and desperate loneliness, I began drafting long, sprawling emails to Reed. Sitting at the small kitchen counter in the dead of night, illuminated only by the harsh blue glow of my laptop screen, I typed out thousands of words. I apologized for the destruction. I acknowledged his quiet goodness. I confessed that I finally understood the sheer magnitude of what I had carelessly thrown away. But I never once clicked the send button. I always held down the backspace key until the screen was entirely blank again. I deleted every single word because I knew, deep in my bones, that he had engineered his new existence to be permanently unreachable on purpose. Sending the messages would only confirm my own pathetic desperation, and I suspected his silence would simply echo back louder than before. The absolute, devastating confirmation of that suspicion happened on a random Tuesday evening in late October. I was exhausted, wearing stained sweatpants and an oversized sweater, carrying Milo strapped tightly to my chest in a fabric carrier as I hurried through the aisles of a premium grocery store on the far west side of the city. I was simply trying to buy diapers and cheap coffee before rushing home to relieve the teenage babysitter I could barely afford. I pushed my squeaking shopping cart around the corner into the brightly lit organic produce section, and my entire body froze into solid ice. He was standing less than 40 feet away from me. Reed looked incredibly healthy. The heavy, exhausted tension that used to permanently pull at the corners of his eyes was completely gone. He was wearing a casual gray sweater, his posture relaxed and open. But the true, lethal shock was not just seeing him, it was seeing the woman standing directly beside him. She was holding a plastic basket, gently leaning her shoulder against his arm as she examined a display of Honeycrisp apples. She was not overly glamorous or flashy. She looked calm, highly intelligent, and completely, effortlessly at ease in his presence. She said something quiet, holding up one of the apples, and Reed looked down at her, and then he laughed. It was a deep, rich, completely unburdened sound that carried clearly over the low hum of the refrigeration units. It was a genuine, open expression of pure joy. I stood paralyzed behind a tall display of imported olive oils, the breath completely knocked out of my lungs. I had not heard him make that exact sound in over 4 years. I had entirely forgotten that he was even capable of that kind of lightness. I waited in absolute terror for him to turn his head, to lock eyes with me, to see the dark circles under my eyes and the cheap clothes I was wearing. But he never looked in my direction. He placed his hand gently on the small of the woman's back, guiding her smoothly toward the checkout registers, utterly and completely absorbed in the peaceful, secure world they were building together. He never even knew I was there. That brief, invisible, entirely accidental moment wounded me far more deeply and permanently than any screaming confrontation or vicious legal battle ever could have. I stood frozen in the grocery store aisle, clutching the handle of my cart while my son slept against my chest, and a terrifying, clarifying truth finally broke over me. For the past 12 months, the lingering fantasy of his punishment had actually been secretly comforting to me. I had desperately wanted to believe he hated me, because if Reed still wanted revenge, it meant he still had to care. It meant I still occupied a space in his mind, but watching him walk away, laughing with a woman who actually deserved his protection, I realized the absolute, horrifying truth. He did not hate me at all. He simply did not think about me anymore. My son was rapidly approaching 1 year old, and by that time, the atmosphere inside our leased apartment had curdled into a permanent, suffocating tension. Wyatt constantly tried to manage my growing resentment with empty motivational slogans he clearly stole from his cheap real estate seminars. He would stand in the cramped kitchen, drinking coffee we could barely afford, and loudly declare that we were simply under pressure, not broken. He insisted that every great success story required a period of intense, character-building struggle. But the reality was that our relationship was not bending under the weight of external pressure. It was rotting entirely from the inside out. The final, fatal revelation did not arrive wrapped in the theatrical cinematic melodrama I once thought accompanied all infidelities. There was no overwhelming scent of a strange woman's perfume lingering on his jacket collar. There were no bright red lipstick smears carelessly left on his shirts, and there were no dramatic, tearful confessions in the middle of the night. The absolute end of our relationship was entirely grounded in the mundane, practical machinery of modern betrayal. It was painfully ordinary. It happened on a rainy Tuesday morning. Wyatt was taking a long, hot shower, the water running loudly behind the thin bathroom door. I was sitting at the small dining table, trying to balance our disastrous checking account. I opened his leather briefcase to look for a specific utility bill he swore he had paid. Instead of the bill, my fingers brushed against a crumpled piece of thick, glossy paper shoved deep into a side pocket. It was a receipt from a boutique luxury hotel located squarely in the downtown financial district. It was time-stamped for 2 o'clock in the afternoon on a Thursday, exactly 3 days prior. He had explicitly told me he was locked in a grueling marathon zoning board meeting that entire afternoon. As I stared blankly at the printed total of $420, his mobile phone, resting on the kitchen counter, briefly lit up with a harsh white glow. A text message preview flashed across the locked screen. It was from a wealthy, recently divorced client he had been aggressively courting for a commercial listing. The message did not contain poetic declarations of love. It was brutally, casually logistical. I left my silver earrings on the nightstand. The message read, "Bring them to the viewing tomorrow at 3 o'clock. A cold, heavy numbness instantly washed over me, completely freezing the blood in my veins. When Wyatt finally emerged from the bathroom, his hair damp and smelling of expensive shampoo, I did not scream. I did not throw the heavy glass coffee pot against the wall. I simply placed the crumpled hotel receipt and his mobile phone side by side on the quartz countertop. He stopped dead in his tracks. The practiced, arrogant charm instantly vanished from his face, replaced by the frantic, cornered look of a man who knows he has absolutely no escape route. When he finally spoke, he did not apologize. Instead, he immediately weaponized his own deep insecurities and tried to turn the argument into a mutual, shared blame. "You have looked at me like a pathetic downgrade from the very second Reed walked out the door," Wyatt snapped, his voice tight and defensive, his hands gesturing wildly. "You punish me every single day because I cannot give you that perfect, rich, heavily insured life my brother gave you. You treat me like a disappointment. Stella. You made me feel completely worthless in my own home." The sheer audacity of his defense took my breath away. It was a vicious, highly calculated strike, and it stung deeply precisely because it contained a microscopic grain of truth. I had constantly compared him to Reed. I had resented his failures. But my resentment absolutely did not excuse his decision to spend $400 on a hotel room while his own infant son wore outgrown, secondhand clothes. However, the infidelity was not even the final nail in his coffin. The true, unforgivable betrayal revealed itself 48 hours later when I conducted a comprehensive, forensic audit of our remaining finances. I logged into a separate, dedicated savings account I had painstakingly built, depositing tiny fractions of my paycheck every week to cover Milo's upcoming first birthday expenses and his necessary pediatric dental checkups. The balance, which should have been just over $2,000, was entirely gone. The screen showed a balance of exactly 14 cents. Wyatt had secretly drained the entire account, he later confessed, his voice dripping with pathetic, whining self-pity, that he used the money to blindly cover his own massive losses on a highly speculative, catastrophic property flipping deal that had completely collapsed. He had literally stolen the financial safety net right out from under his own child to keep his own fraudulent, crumbling ego afloat. In that precise, clarifying moment, something fundamental inside my chest permanently snapped. I finally understood the cold, terrifying logic of my former husband. Screaming is for people who still harbor a desperate hope that the other person will change. Silence is for people who are entirely finished. Instead of engaging in another exhausting circular argument, I went to work. I sat at my computer for 6 straight hours, quietly and methodically mirroring the exact, document-driven ruthlessness Reed had once used to cleanly excise me from his life. I printed out every single bank statement showing the unauthorized transfers. I printed the hotel receipts, the utility shut-off notices he had hidden, the lease records proving his financial insolvency, and the endless, undeniable proof of his unpaid child expenses. I gathered all of it into a thick, heavily bound folder. The very next morning, while he was out trying to salvage his doomed real estate deals, I packed my son's clothes, my essential documents, and a few basic necessities into the trunk of my car. I left the thick folder sitting squarely in the middle of his rented glass dining table. I drove away and immediately filed formal, aggressive petitions for full legal custody and mandatory child support through a state agency. The ultimate collapse of his professional life happened just a few weeks later. A rigorous formal compliance review was suddenly opened by the state real estate board against his boutique brokerage. It centered around missing, highly illegal disclosure paperwork on one of his few successful commercial listings. Wyatt panicked. He called me incessantly, leaving dozens of frantic, breathless voicemails. He begged me to contact the compliance board and lie for him. He wanted me to swear under oath that I had personally mailed the missing legal documents on a specific date, framing the catastrophe as a simple administrative error on my part to shield his license from permanent revocation. "You have to do this for me, Stella," he pleaded over the phone, his voice cracking with genuine, pathetic terror. "I am the father of your child. We are all we have left. You owe me your loyalty." I sat in the tiny, cramped living room of my new, incredibly cheap apartment, holding the phone to my ear, and I felt absolutely nothing for him. I finally understood that covering for the reckless, selfish mistakes of weak men was exactly how I had wrecked my own beautiful life in the first place. I had sacrificed my marriage, my reputation, and my entire future because I was addicted to the dangerous illusion of saving someone. I was permanently done throwing my own body over his landmines. "I do not owe you a single thing," I told him, my voice perfectly calm, steady, and devoid of any lingering affection. "Do not ever call this number again." I hung up the phone and blocked his contact information permanently. His career began to rapidly and publicly crumble over the next month, not because I actively took steps to destroy him, but simply because I finally stopped absorbing the heavy toxic fallout of his own irresponsibility. I stepped out of the way and let gravity take its natural, devastating course. By the end of that brutal year, the grand, sweeping romance that had cost me absolutely everything was entirely reduced to ash. I was living completely alone with Milo in a tiny, drafty apartment on the wrong side of the city. I was working exhausting hours. I was poorer than I had ever been in my entire adult life, and I was entirely stripped of the comfortable, upper-middle-class armor I used to wear. But as I watched my son take his very first, unsteady steps across a cheap linoleum floor, I felt a strange, profound sense of peace settling over my tired shoulders. I was ruined, yes, but I was finally permanently free from the suffocating, destructive trap of Wyatt Calder's endless delusions. Exactly 3 full years after my divorce was finalized, the very last remnants of my old life forcefully dragged me back to the surface. I had settled into a grim, exhausting routine, raising my son in our small, drafty apartment, convinced that the past was entirely buried. Then, on a cold Tuesday afternoon, a heavy certified envelope arrived in my mailbox. It was a formal legal subpoena. Wyatt, completely bankrupt and drowning in the toxic consequences of his own endless failures, had decided to launch a desperate, pathetic civil suit against his older brother. He formally accused Reed of severe financial manipulation, claiming that Reed had maliciously used the chaotic distraction of our divorce proceedings to unlawfully strip Wyatt of family trust disbursements he firmly believed he was owed. Because several massive financial transfers had passed through our joint household checking accounts during the final 6 months of my marriage, the forensic accountants legally required my testimony. I had absolutely no choice but to board a cheap commercial flight and travel halfway across the country to Denver, Colorado, to sit for a formal legal deposition. The morning before the official hearing, I sat in a freezing glass-walled conference room high above the Denver skyline, preparing with a neutral court mediator. They slid a massive, rigorously organized financial ledger across the polished mahogany table. It was the complete, unredacted record of Reed Calder's private finances over a 5-year period. As I slowly turned the heavy pages, the sheer, staggering scope of my former husband's silent sacrifice laid itself bare before my eyes. I saw the comprehensive, documented proof of everything Wyatt had kept hidden. There were authorized wire transfers for $14,000 to cover Wyatt's severe federal tax arrears. There were endless payments for expensive business insurance gaps, emergency housing deposits, and hefty retainers for specialized licensing counsel to save Wyatt from professional ruin. Reed had not just been the stable, responsible older brother. He had been the massive, hidden, load-bearing support beam holding up multiple collapsing lives, silently absorbing the crushing weight of Wyatt's incompetence without ever demanding gratitude or recognition. But the detail that completely shattered me was a specific, quiet line item dated 4 years prior. It was a paid invoice for $800 directed to the high-risk obstetric clinic. It was the exact bill for the preliminary fertility consultation that I had arrogantly assumed our standard household budget had simply absorbed. Reed had quietly paid for it out of his own liquidated private emergency fund, deliberately hiding the financial strain just to keep my daily anxiety levels down. He had actively protected my peace of mind while I was actively planning to destroy his. An hour later, the heavy oak door to the main deposition room opened, and Reed walked in. I held my breath, my fingernails digging painfully into the palms of my hands. He looked absolutely incredible. The heavy, gray exhaustion that used to permanently pull at the corners of his eyes was entirely gone. He was wearing a perfectly tailored navy blue suit, his posture completely relaxed, radiating a deep, unshakable health. I desperately expected at least one single, fleeting look that acknowledged our shared, catastrophic history. I waited for a flicker of residual anger, a micro-expression of grief, or even just cold, bitter triumph. I received absolutely nothing. His dark eyes swept calmly across the room, passing completely over my face as if I were a blank stretch of painted drywall, and settled professionally on the stenographer. I was not a villain in his story anymore. I was not a tragic memory. I was simply a minor, irrelevant administrative hurdle he needed to clear before lunch. The entire deposition was a brutal, clinical slaughter. Wyatt sat across the long table, sweating profusely through his cheap dress shirt, nervously tapping his pen against his legal pad. Reed's attorney, a ruthless, sharply dressed woman with terrifying surgical precision, took exactly 45 minutes to completely dismantle my former lover. She did not raise her voice. She simply produced heavily documented, signed promissory notes, explicit reimbursement agreements, and legally protected trust disbursement logs for every single dollar Wyatt claimed was stolen. Mr. Calder, is this your authorized signature on the loan agreement dated April the 4th? The attorney asked, sliding a document across the table. Yes, but the verbal understanding was different, Wyatt stammered, his face flushing a deep, humiliated red. The verbal understanding is irrelevant to the binding contract you executed, she replied coldly. She methodically exposed Wyatt's entire foundational narrative of being a self-made, successful businessman as a pathetic, legally baseless fiction. Reed sat perfectly still the entire time, watching his brother flail and drown in his own lies, his face a mask of absolute, terrifying composure. By the time the mediator formally concluded the session, Wyatt's aggressive lawsuit had been entirely reduced to dust. I practically ran out of the towering glass building, desperate to escape the suffocating humiliation of the conference room. I stepped out onto the wide, sunlit concrete sidewalk, wrapping my thin coat tightly around my shoulders against the crisp, high-altitude air, and waited for a taxi to take me back to the airport. That was when I saw the final, devastating twist that permanently resolved the entire story. A sleek, dark SUV pulled smoothly up to the curb just a few yards away from me. The heavy passenger door opened, and a beautiful, casually dressed woman stepped out onto the sidewalk. She turned and reached into the back seat, unbuckling a little girl who looked to be exactly 2 years old. The child had Reed's unmistakable dark hair and his bright, intelligent eyes. At that exact moment, the heavy glass doors of the office building pushed open behind me. Reed emerged into the bright afternoon sunlight. The little girl immediately looked up, shrieked with pure, unadulterated joy, and ran directly across the concrete toward him. Reed dropped his heavy leather briefcase without a second thought and knelt right there on the dirty sidewalk. Catching his daughter perfectly in his arms, he lifted her high into the air, a massive, brilliant smile breaking across his face, the absolute, effortless trust in that single, beautiful motion completely shattered whatever fragile pieces were left of my heart. It was a picture of pure, unbroken safety. I stood exactly 10 feet away from them, frozen in place. Years of agonizing grief, deep, festering shame, and desperate, rehearsed explanations were trapped right behind my teeth. Burning my throat, I wanted to scream that I was sorry, I wanted him to look at me and acknowledge that I had paid the ultimate price for my sins, but Reed only stood back up, balancing his laughing daughter easily on his hip. He walked over to the vehicle, opened the rear door, and carefully buckled the little girl into her protective car seat. He closed the heavy door, stepped over to his beautiful wife, and gently kissed her temple, his hand resting warmly on her lower back. They got into the vehicle together, merged smoothly into the heavy downtown traffic, and drove away without uttering a single word. In that final, invisible moment, standing completely alone on a cold city sidewalk, I finally understood the true, towering climax of my own story. Reed's ultimate revenge was never the brutal, fast-tracked divorce. It was never the dense legal paperwork, the loss of the beautiful craftsman house, or even his sudden, chilling disappearance. His real revenge was that he simply walked away from the wreckage I created and painstakingly rebuilt the exact kind of life I had always claimed I wanted. He built a life that was profoundly steady, deeply warm, fully earned, and completely whole. And he rebuilt it in a bright, secure world where I and his treacherous brother simply no longer existed at all. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. I would love to know where you are tuning in from. So please leave a comment down below sharing your location and your thoughts on everything that happened. If you enjoyed this journey, please make sure to subscribe to the Olivia Revenge Stories channel. Give this video a big like, and do not forget to press the hype button so this story can be heard by even more people.